The morning Harlan Voss decided to sell the hotel, he made sure Lee wasn't in the building. That detail mattered. Not because it was cruel, though it was, but because it was deliberate. He had called the front desk at 7:43 and asked them to send her to the off-site linen warehouse on Calloway Street to review the inventory discrepancy. There was no discrepancy. The warehouse manager confirmed later that he hadn't requested any visit. Harlan had simply needed her gone for 4 hours, and he had used the one thing he knew she would never question: work. Lee Ashford Voss, 37 years old, had been the general manager of the Voss Grand Hotel for 9 years. She had also been Harlan's wife for 6 of those 9 years. And for 6 years she had believed, because he told her so, because his family told her so, because the way they looked at her across dinner tables told her so, that she was lucky to have been invited in. The Voss family owned the hotel. Lee just ran it. That was how they framed it. Every single time. Harlan Elliott Voss, 44 years old, was the kind of man who wore his family name like a second skin, so comfortable in it that he had forgotten it was something he'd been born into rather than earn. He was the only son of Reginald Voss, who had built the Voss Grand from a single mid-century property in downtown Charleston into a boutique collection of 7 luxury hotels along the eastern seaboard. Reginald was 81 now, mostly retired, mostly silent at board meetings. But his presence still moved through every hallway of the flagship property on King Street like weather. You felt it before you saw it. Harlan's mother, Constance Voss, 69, did not attend board meetings. She attended everything else: charity luncheons, lobby walkthrough, the quarterly family dinner at which Lee had, for 6 years, sat at the far end of the table and been addressed primarily in the form of complaints. The new chef is too experimental. That was always Constance. The spa booking system is broken. That was Harlan's younger sister, Bryn, 38, who had never worked a day inside any of the hotels but held a board seat regardless. The lobby flowers are wrong again. Back to Constance. Lee would take notes. She would follow up. She would fix everything by Monday and hear nothing about it until something else was wrong. She had grown up in Somerville, 45 minutes outside of Charleston, in a house where the pipes froze in January and nobody called a plumber because the call cost more than the fix. She had put herself through the Rosen College of Hospitality Management on scholarships and 2 part-time jobs. She had started at the Voss Grand as an assistant events coordinator at 26, worked her way to front office director, then operations manager, then GM by 33. The youngest general manager in the property's history, which Reginald had announced with visible pride at a staff meeting, and which Constance had acknowledged by saying the bar must have been low. When Harlan proposed, Lee's closest friend, a woman named Dory who managed a restaurant 2 blocks away, had said, "Make sure he sees you and not just what you can do for him." Lee had said she was sure. She was not sure. She had been 29 and in love and too tired from working 60-hour weeks to interrogate what kind of love it actually was. The thing about being good at your job when your job belongs to your husband's family is that your competence becomes invisible in a specific way. Not unseen. They saw it. They catalogued every improvement in occupancy rate, every glowing review on travel sites, every repeat corporate client she had cultivated from cold outreach into annual contract. They saw it, they just never attached her name to it. In 6 years, Lee had taken the flagship property from 71% annual occupancy to 93%. She had negotiated 3 new corporate accounts worth a combined $4.8 million annually. She had overseen a full renovation of the East Wing that came in 6% under budget and won a regional design award. She had done all of this while managing a staff of 212 people, while sitting through dinners where Constance asked her why she still hadn't learned to make proper biscuits, while sleeping next to a man who had started, somewhere around year 4, to look through her rather than at her. She noticed she brought it up twice. Both times, Harlan said she was being sensitive. The second time he said it, his phone buzzed on the nightstand, and he picked it up and turned away from her in one fluid motion, as if the conversation was already over because he had declared it over. She lay in the dark for a long time after that. Dory was the one who told her about the woman. Not with evidence. Dory was not the type to surveil, but with the particular expression of a friend who has been holding something for too long and can no longer hold it. They were sitting in Dory's restaurant after closing, both of them drinking the wine that didn't sell that week, and Dory said, "There's something I need to tell you, and I need you to know I've been trying to find the right time, and I've decided there isn't one." Her name was Tamsin. She was 31. She worked at an architecture firm that had done some renovation consulting for the hotel 2 years ago, which meant Harlan had met her on Lee's watch, in Lee's hotel, during a project Lee had managed. Lee drank the rest of her wine in silence. Then she said, "How long have you known?" 4 months. Dory said. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry for knowing. Be sorry if you'd kept it longer. She drove home that night and did not confront Harlan, not because she was afraid of him, but because she needed to know first what she was walking into. She needed to understand clearly and completely the full geometry of what had been built around her without her knowledge. So she waited. She watched. She kept working. What Harlan did not know, what none of them knew, was that Lee had left the role of general manager 14 months ago. Not on paper. On paper, she was still GM. She still had the office, still attended the staff meetings, still signed off on the weekly reports. But 14 months ago, a private equity group called Harrow Capital had made a quiet approach to Lee. Not to the hotel, not to the Voss family, to Lee specifically, based on a reputation that had traveled further than she realized. They had identified her as the operational architect behind the Voss Grand's turnaround, and they had offered her something she had never been offered by anyone in her professional life. Ownership. Not a title, actual ownership. The arrangement was structured carefully, over several months, with lawyers who were not connected to Charleston and an NDA that Lee's own attorney had reviewed line by line. Harrow Capital would acquire a portfolio of 4 independent boutique hotels, 2 in Savannah, 1 in Asheville, 1 in Richmond, and Lee would take a 38% equity stake in exchange for taking operational control as CEO. Her investment was her expertise, formalized. The deal closed 11 months ago. She had told no one. Not Dory. Not her sister in Somerville. No one. She had not told Harlan, who would have told his mother, who would have told his father, who would have turned it into a negotiation that served the Voss family's interests rather than her own. She had learned, slowly and at some cost, that the only things that stayed hers were the things she kept quiet. The Harrow portfolio properties were called, collectively, the Ashford Collection. She had chosen the name herself. Ashford was her name before she became a Voss, and she was not sentimental about much, but she was sentimental about that. By the time Harlan made the call to the linen warehouse, Lee was the CEO of a hospitality group with 4 properties, combined annual revenue of $31 million, and a 5th acquisition in negotiation. She had also, 6 weeks prior, submitted a letter of interest to acquire a 5th property, a historic inn in Beaufort that had been quietly listed after a family dispute over inheritance. None of this appeared anywhere with her married name. She got the call from the linen warehouse at 9:45. There was no discrepancy. She thanked the warehouse manager, drove back to the hotel, and parked in her usual spot. The one that still said general manager, even though she had long ago accepted that the title meant something different to her than it did to the people who had given it to her. She took the service elevator because it was faster, and because she had long ago stopped performing visibility for people who didn't see her anyway. What she found when she reached the executive floor was Harlan, his father Reginald, the family's attorney, a man named Douglas Pruitt, whom she had met at various holiday parties, and 2 men she did not recognize in suits that suggested they were not local. The conference room had been used, water glasses still on the table, a folder with a yellow sticky tab on the edge. Harlan saw her first. Something moved across his face, not guilt, exactly, more like the brief recalculation of a man who realizes the timing of his plan has slipped. I didn't expect you back yet, he said. The warehouse didn't have an issue, she said, which I'm sure you already knew. Reginald looked out the window. Douglas Pruitt studied his phone. Harlan said, we should talk. They talked in the small sitting room adjacent to the presidential suite, the one with the low sofas and the 19th century landscape paintings that Lee had selected during the East Wing renovation. He sat across from her. He did not offer her anything to drink. He told her he had been meaning to bring this to her for several weeks. He told her the family had been in discussions about the future of the flagship property. He told her the market conditions were favorable. He used the word strategic 4 times in 6 minutes. Then he told her the hotel had been sold. Not that it was being considered for sale, not that an offer was on the table. Sold, past tense, document signed. She sat very still. To whom? A hospitality investment group, he said, based in Atlanta. They're planning to rebrand under their existing portfolio. What does that mean for the staff? He paused in a way that told her the staff had not been a significant part of the conversation. There'll be a transition period. What does that mean for my position? Another pause. The new ownership will want to bring in their own operations team. She looked at him for a moment, at the man she had married, sitting in a room she had furnished, delivering news about a building she had spent 9 years of her life rebuilding, in a tone that suggested she should be grateful he was telling her at all. Is there anything else? She said. He seemed to take this as acceptance. He uncrossed his legs. I've had papers drawn up. For the divorce, I thought, given everything, it would be cleaner to handle both at once. She said nothing. Tamsin and I, you know, Dory isn't subtle. he said it almost gently, as if he was doing her a favor by confirming it. I think we've both known for a while that this hasn't been working. Leigh looked at the landscape painting on the wall to his left. She had found it at an estate sale in Aiken. She had paid $400 for it and had it restored by a woman in Colombia who specialized in 19th century oil. It was worth considerably more now. It would stay with the hotel. All right, she said. You'll review the papers? I'll have my attorney review them. She stood. She straightened her jacket. She walked out. She sat in her car in the parking garage for 11 minutes. She did not cry. She had done the crying, she realized, a long time ago. In increments so small she hadn't recognized it as grief. The night with the turned phone. The dinner where Constance had addressed a staffing question to Harlan, even though Leigh was the one who managed staff. The morning she had gotten the call about the Ashford deal closing and had sat in this same car, in this same garage, and had no one she could tell. She had been mourning this marriage for 2 years. The paperwork was just the formal acknowledgement. She took out her phone and called her attorney. Not the one who handled her GM contract with the Voss family. The other one. The following is what happened in the 6 weeks after Leigh signed the divorce papers. The Atlanta group that had purchased the Voss Grand, a firm called Meridian Collective, had, as part of their due diligence, identified 2 primary suppliers whose contracts were foundational to the property's operational continuity. One was a linen and uniform supplier. One was a food and beverage distributor covering the hotel's restaurant and event catering. Both contracts were held, not through the Voss family entity, but through an operational services agreement that had been set up 3 years prior during a corporate restructuring. At the time, Leigh had been the one to oversee the restructuring. At the time, she had, at the direction of the family's own attorney, for tax efficiency purposes, established the supplier relationships under a separate LLC. That LLC was registered to Leigh Ashford. Not Leigh Voss, Leigh Ashford. Her name before the marriage. The name she had filed the LLC under 2 years into the marriage, during a period when she had started, quietly, to think about what was hers. It had not been a plan. It had been a precaution. But precautions have a way of becoming plans when the thing you were protecting against actually happens. Meridian Collective's operations director called Douglas Pruitt on a Tuesday morning to ask about transferring the supplier contracts to the new ownership entity. Douglas Pruitt called Harlan. Harlan called Leigh. She let it go to voicemail. The second call came from Reginald himself. She had not heard his voice in 3 weeks, not since the day in the conference room. He sounded, for the first time in the 9 years she had known him, uncertain. Leigh, he said. There seems to be a complication. Yes, she said. Douglas says the supplier agreements are in my name. Yes, a silence. We weren't aware. I know, the transfer, we'd need your signature or your authorization. She let that sit for a moment. Outside her office window. The office at Ashford Collections Administrative Suite, which the Voss family did not know existed. The Savannah River moved slowly in the afternoon light. She had a meeting in 40 minutes with the Beaufort Properties sellers. She had a staff review at 4. She had a life that she had been building quietly in the margins of the life they thought she was living. I understand, she said. Have Douglas send me the request in writing. I'll review it with my attorney. Leigh, the closing timeline. I'm aware of the timeline, Reginald. I managed this property's operational calendar for 9 years. She ended the call. The request arrived in writing. Her attorney reviewed it. They responded with a counter. Not a refusal, not a demand. A counter. Specific, measured, and prepared by someone who had spent several months, prior to the divorce filing, understanding exactly what she held and exactly what it was worth. The supplier contracts represented approximately $2.3 million in annual throughput. Without them, Meridian Collective's transition timeline would slip by a minimum of 4 months, while they renegotiated from scratch with new vendors. A process complicated by the fact that the Voss Grand's particular standards, which Leigh had spent years establishing, were not easily replicated on short notice. The linen supplier in particular had a custom program for the hotel's historic guest rooms that took 8 months to develop. Her counter asked for 3 things. First, a settlement figure that reflected 9 years of operational contribution to a property whose valuation had increased by 62% during her tenure. Second, the landscape painting from the presidential suite sitting room. Third, a formal letter from the Voss family acknowledging her role in the hotel's growth, suitable for use in future professional contexts. She did not ask for the hotel back. She did not ask Harlan to come back. She did not ask for an apology because she had stopped needing one somewhere between the linen warehouse and the parking garage. Harlan called again. This time she answered. This is not what we agreed, he said. He did not sound angry, exactly. He sounded like a man who has discovered that a game he thought he was winning has rules he wasn't told. You didn't agree anything with me, she said. You informed me. There's a difference. The contractor agreements were established using family resources. They were established using my labor, my vendor relationships, and my professional reputation. The LLC was formed legally and properly. You're welcome to have Douglas verify that, Lee. He shifted tactics. She could hear it, the softening. We were married. We built this together. She almost laughed. Not bitterly. Just with the clean, clear recognition of how long she had waited to hear him use the word together and how completely it had lost its power now that it was being deployed as a bargaining chip. Sent my counter to Douglas, she said. He'll know what to do with it. The Voss family took 10 days to respond. She did not fill those 10 days with waiting. She flew to Asheville for a property review. She finalized the Beaufort acquisition paperwork. She interviewed 3 candidates for a director of operations role she had been building toward for months. She also, on a Wednesday evening, had dinner with Dory, who had been kept partially in the dark for reasons of legal caution, but who deserved now to know at least the outline. Dory listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her. When Lee finished, Dory picked up her wine glass and said, "You built an entire company." 4 hotels, Lee said. Almost 5, while running their hotel. Dory was quiet for a moment. Did you always know it would end like this? Lee thought about it honestly. I knew it would end, she said. I didn't know what I'd have when it did. I just decided to make sure I had something. The Voss family's response came through Douglas Pruitt in writing, which was the appropriate channel, and also told her they had accepted the framework of the negotiation she had set. They agreed to the settlement figure. It was not the number she had named in the counter. It was 84% of it, which her attorney said was the expected result of a first counter, and which she accepted without drama. They agreed to the letter of professional acknowledgement. It was drafted by Douglas and reviewed by her attorney and revised twice before it said what she needed it to say, that Lee Ashford had served as general manager of the Voss Grand Hotel for 9 years and had been the primary operational architect of its growth during that period. No qualifications, no softening, just the record. The landscape painting was delivered to her administrative office in Savannah on a Thursday morning. The driver who brought it was one of the hotel's longtime maintenance staff, a man named Carl, who had been there since before Lee arrived, and he stood in the doorway for a moment before he left and said, "We're going to miss you, Ms. Lee." She thanked him. She meant it. The divorce was finalized on a Friday. She signed the papers in her attorney's office, read every page as she had been trained to read contracts, not as a formality but as a record, and signed her name as Lee Ashford. The hyphen was gone. The Voss was gone. She was not going to carry a name into the next chapter of her life that had been used, consistently and without apology, as a way to remind her where she stood. Her attorney offered congratulations, then caught herself. "Is that the right word?" "It's fine," Lee said. "It's accurate." Meridian Collective's transition into the Voss Grand took 6 months. During that time, the supplier renegotiations added delays that matched, almost exactly, what Lee's attorney had projected. Meridian was professional about it. They were not villains, just buyers who had purchased a building without fully understanding what had kept it running. Reginald Voss retired fully from the board 3 months after the sale. He sent Lee a brief note, handwritten, which surprised her. That said only, "We didn't value what we had. I won't pretend otherwise." She read it twice and put it in a drawer. Constance did not about. Harlan and Tamsin moved into a townhouse in the Cannonborough neighborhood. She learned this from Dory, who had learned it from the restaurant supply network, which knew everything about everyone in Charleston. She did not feel much about it. She noticed that she didn't feel much about it, and took that as information about the marriage she'd been in. The Ashford Collection opened its 5th property, the Beaufort Inn, which they renamed the Ashford at Beaufort, in the spring. It was a 22-room property on a tidal creek, with a dock and a restaurant that used a wood-burning hearth and a menu built around local watermen's catch. Lee stood on the dock the morning of the soft opening, coffee in hand, watching the light come across the water. She had not slept much. She had been going over the event timeline in her head since 4 in the morning. There was always something that could go wrong, and usually 1 or 2 things that did, and she had made peace with that years ago. Her director of operations, a woman named Suki she had recruited from a Nashville property, came out to find her at 7:15. "The flowers for the dining room are wrong," Suki said. "Different variety than what we ordered." Leigh looked at her. "Are they still beautiful?" Suki blinked. "Yes, then they're fine." She turned back to the water. A blue heron stood at the edge of the marsh, perfectly still, waiting for whatever was coming next. She understood the feeling. People sometimes asked Lee, later, whether she had planned all of it, the LLC, the Ashford Collection. the contracts filed under her maiden name. Whether she had seen the end of the marriage coming and had positioned herself deliberately, she was always honest about the answer, which was, not entirely. She had made individual decisions, each one reasonable in isolation. She had protected what she built because she had built it, and because she had spent enough time around people who confused proximity with ownership to know that she could not rely on others to understand the difference. But she had not known, when she filed the LLC paperwork in a lawyer's office on a Tuesday afternoon while still wearing her Voss Grand General Manager badge, that she was building the foundation of a company that would employ over 200 people and generate $31 million in annual revenue. She had not known she would need it the way she needed it. She had only known that it was hers, and that hers needed to stay hers. And that sometimes the only way to make sure of that was to do the work quietly, in the margins, until the margins became the main thing. Harlan had signed the divorce papers in a hotel he thought his family owned. He had not known, none of them had known, that he was also signing over the last hold they'd had on a woman who had spent 6 years turning their asset into her proof of concept. She had not corrected them. She had simply kept building, and when the walls they'd built around her finally came down, she was already standing somewhere else entirely. Somewhere they had never thought to look, because they had never thought she was going anywhere at all.